So, welcome to our real event tonight about working the system, how, when, and why to tap into public schools for assessment and support for twice exceptional learners. I am Callie Turk, and I am one of the co founders of Real, and I'm going to hand this over to my partner at Real, Abby, who will introduce herself and say a few words about Real for anyone who's new to our organization before we start the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I work with Callie and Yael at Real, and I'm also a graduate student at Bridges with Callie and work at a dyslexic school as well. So do a bunch of different things related to twice exceptionality and neurodiversity. Okay, there we go. Now, see, then I can get it working. All right. So Real, for those of you new to our organization, thank you for joining us this evening. Real is a nonprofit organization that ensures that twice exceptional students in Silicon Valley really thrive in school by raising the parent and the educator awareness and understanding through resources, tools, events, and services. We like to think of ourselves as kind of a bridge between these different constituents, all in support of our 2E children. We have a number of different shareable resources and tools that you can find on our website, and the URL is there. It's real2e.org. We have this great 2E fact sheet, a quick sheet about is your child twice exceptional, and a bunch of other resources for teachers and parents on the site. We also have a new YouTube channel where all of our events that we record, we publish them to our Real channel. So I encourage you to go there and check out all of the great talks that we've been doing over the past few years, and subscribe to our channel so you can get updates when new events are recorded. And we wanted to just highlight 3 upcoming events that we have over the next few months. Next week, I think that's already next week, we will have a quarterly parent support group that we do in partnership with Parents Helping Parents. And then in the end of April, I will be putting on a workshop that I also gave to this group a few months ago in partnership with Parents Place on strength-based strategies. And then in early May, we're going to have one of our graduate colleagues, Dr. Marcy Dan, and she's going to come and talk about slow processing speed and twice exceptional children. And you can RSVP for any and all of these on our website. And then in addition to our website, we've got a bunch of other ways you can connect with us. So we've got an active twice exceptional Google group where parents ask each other questions about 2E in the Bay Area. We've got a Facebook group, we have Twitter, and like I mentioned, our YouTube as well.
Thank you so much, Abby, for giving a great overview of Real. We're so excited for everyone who's in our community. And I am, like I said before, just very excited for tonight's session that features Dr. Hanna Merk. And we love to say the doctor part because she received her doctorate in the last year. And so we like to really emphasize that. And Laura Kimpton. And I'm going to introduce each of them in a little more detail right before they present. But I just wanted to say the reason I'm very excited about the presentation we have here about thinking about tapping into public schools is because I personally have had so many questions about this topic over the years. And almost every time we have a session with parents, questions come up about what our rights are, what the schools need to be doing, who pays for what, how to get assessments. We hear all kinds of myths or things that we think might be myths. We're not sure if they're myths or fact. And I just felt like there was a lot of stuff I wanted to clear up. So in some ways, yes, this presentation is for all of you, but it's really for me because I had just so much I wanted to learn. And I felt like Dr. Merk and Laura Kimpton were just the right people to have to help teach us all about this really important topic. So the way we're going to run things tonight is Hannah's actually going to speak first. She's going to talk about the dissertation results that she recently defended to get her dissertation and her EDD from USC. And then we will have Laura Kimpton talk about from her perspective as a special education advocate. And then we're going to run through some facts and myths really quickly. I have a list of statements that I want to know. Are they fact or are they myth? And I think I think Laura will have cleared some of that up in her presentation, and some of it we'll go through together and just make sure we get the facts. And then we'll have an open Q&A. And I do have questions that were submitted as part of the RSVP process, and you are more than welcome to submit questions in the chat. Please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are, how old your kids are, whatever is really pertinent for you right now, and just feel free to talk with each other throughout as needed in the chat. That's an open space for conversation. So we are going to jump in right away. I'm going to stop sharing, or actually ask Abby to stop sharing, and we're going to let Hanna get her presentation queued up. And while I introduce you to her. So Dr. Hanna Merk is someone that I met through the parenting grapevine. I don't even remember how, and we had several walks together, and I just found her to be so inspirational, and I was so excited about the dissertation work she was doing, and I felt it was really important for our community to know about her, because she lives right here in our community and has also her own personal experience. So just to say a few words about her, she's a lifelong learner who's passionate about trying to make sense of complex human phenomena based on science, research, and experience. As I mentioned, she recently completed her dissertation that focused on understanding the critical role of parents in 2E learners' diagnosis and access to supports. In addition to receiving her EDD from USC, she holds an MBA from INSEAD in France and a BA in Engineering and Economics from Brown University. She has a background in corporate strategy and finance. She most recently was the managing director of Merk Investments, and she also has a lot of experience in educational leadership and as a nonprofit executive. She's originally from Finland, but has been in the Bay Area for 20 years, and amazingly to me, she has 4 children, and they have attended many different Bay Area schools, and she has a very unique vantage point in understanding the educational ecosystem that we have here in Silicon Valley. So Hanna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I'm really, really excited to be here as well, because I have been in your shoes, Callie and Abby and everyone else, as a parent of a twice exceptional child myself, and as one who knew that there's so much more that I need to know. Let's see if I can manage the slides. Tell me if it's working. Yes, it's working. Great. So Callie already explained my life story, so I can pretty much skip this one. But I wanted to perhaps point out the fact about my 4 children. So 3 of them are just simply exceptional. Actually, 4 of them are exceptional. Our youngest is twice exceptional. And that is really what threw me into this space, because I as a parent, I realized that I didn't know what I needed to know. And the story there really was that it took me, from the time that I knew that something needed really addressing, it took me 5 years to find the diagnosis, to actually really stumble across the word that she might be twice exceptional. I had to come up with it, and then I had to find the proof for it. And that's then, that kind of opened the can of worms, and I realized that I'm not the only one here in this space. And I really wanted to then learn more. And that led into then myself changing completely my career from for-profit to not for-profit. So currently, and as a culmination of that, now I finished my dissertation, and I'll share some of those findings, but obviously that's still only the start, because this is the beginning of the path of sharing the findings and building on that experience. And really, my goal is really help others learn from this experience that I've gathered and can continue building on it. I'm also involved with with an ed tech startup right now. So that's another direction in which I could be perhaps taking it. So bear with me. Here we go. So always starting with the child front and center, their perspective. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to help these young people, help the children as they grow into their own personas, to realize their potential, to realize that they are wonderful and unique, and they are good. And all of their wonderful, crazy ideas, even if they seem messy at times, it's really about finding the right environment and the right tools to help them unleash their superpowers. That's what I want to do. So then, I was describing that there's so much that I didn't know in the beginning. I still don't know it. But as I started my research, I really came up with this idea of that there's this gap of knowledge. There's this thing that I need to know. And there's existing research that only gets you so far. And then there's all of this experience that parents have on top of that is not really, it's not easy to come by. Real is doing a fantastic job in getting all of these pieces, all of the information in one place, but there's still so much of it is in our heads, in our collective lived experience. And that's what I was trying to get to. So what I call the 2E knowledge gap between what typical parents and typical teachers, frankly, what they know, and then the increasing knowledge that we all need as parents of 2E learners so we can help them. And which hopefully also the teachers will eventually also get. And what prior research, before my work, what prior research showed is that parents of 2E children, they need to be the key people initiating diagnosis. They need to be the ones influencing the self-perception, a fancy word for it, the way the child feels about themselves. And they are the key people enabling and advocating for support. That's what I started with. And I said, okay, this is the area that I want to learn. I need to learn more about. And I went out and I spoke to numerous people, but the study itself focuses actually the stories of 10 families and of their children and those parents and how they discovered what they discovered. And I'm going to skip through the mechanics of a study because that gets to be hairy and boring. And I'm going to go directly into the findings. So this is what my research of these 10 families showed. There are 9 different themes. I'm not going to go through all of these themes tonight because not all of them are as relevant to the topic. But this is what I found out. First, there is a time lag between, as it was in my case as well, there's a time lag between when you as a parent, you know there's something that needs attention, but you can't quite put your finger on it. So between that observation of a need and then the actual 2E diagnosis, it's not a question of weeks or months, it's a question of years. And it's years of struggle. So that's the first point. Second point is that as parents start voicing these concerns they have, they face dismissiveness from the entire population. I'll get into the details of that. Now, that leads to the fact that there's nobody else. It is the parent. The parent is the crucial element that is needed for the 2E diagnosis. Even if you're not, as a parent, doing the diagnosis, if you don't get active, the diagnosis will never take place. Fourth, parents lack knowledge about their right to demand evaluation. And this is exactly going today's topic, is that within the school system, there is a certain process you need to follow. Otherwise, it does not get done. Then fifth, even within using the system, parents still rely on outside resources, so outside the public school system, to seek accurate 2E diagnosis. I'll go into detail on that. And then even after diagnosis, parents do employ outside resources to support their learners. The next point is obvious, which is that since you're employing outside resources, then your socioeconomic factors will influence what's accessible to you. And this gets to the question of equity. I will not go into detail on that. That's going to be another evening, but that's unfortunately an obvious point that comes out of that. So then eighth point was that parents throughout this learning process, they develop very specialized 2E expertise. And that's what we're trying to share. There's this amazing amount of knowledge that's out there because of this, the process the parents have gone through. And lastly, I'm not the only one for whom it has been a career-changing experience. Because of this year-long journey, it's going to influence what many parents end up doing. And that's not necessarily bad at all. But that does also tie into the socioeconomic point, which is that not everybody has the opportunity to, in a way, completely shift their career to go for this. And that's another point that I will not go into too much at length at this point. Happy to expand on it at a separate occasion. So then the time lag. So then don't be worried about the graph. This is just actually showing the data behind it. These are obviously fake names, pseudonyms for everybody, but the scale is years. So if you look at it, all of these bars are the age of a child when the parent knew there was something that needed help in addressing. And the line shows how many years it took beyond that for the diagnosis to take place. So obviously ranging from child to child, but in every case it was years, and on average it was between 4 and 5 years from when you knew your child needed help and when you knew what to call and where to look for that help specifically. Then here are some of the contributing factors. Why did it take so long? I bucketed them into 3 different things, which is that, first of all, people said, well, it's nothing. You know, this child is brilliant. They can read at age 3. They are so dazzling that we tend to look at the glasses half full at that point. And everybody else around it looks at the glasses half full without focusing on the facts that the child may not be happy. They are not well adjusted. They are showing signs, and we want to ignore those signs. And it's not necessarily us, it is really the teachers and other people around them who say, don't worry about it. That's going to take care of itself. Let's focus and celebrate on these dazzling, wonderful things here. So they say it's nothing. The second thing that you face is that, oh, it's you. You are seeing things. You are taking things out of perspective. You are, a pain in the rear kind of parent. And you'll face that too, it's you. And third, which is really the most hurtful, is that it's the child, is that we hear from other, from teachers, from the other spouse, perhaps, from other parents that, well, if only the child would work harder, if only they would sit down and focus, if only they would do this. Yeah, and people will start labeling the child as defiant or difficult, rather than realizing that it's obviously not the child's fault. And that's what really is the hurtful thing. And if you just imagine, when you look at the previous slide, that it takes on average 4 to 5 years, and if this keeps happening for 4 to 5 years, you can imagine what it does to how the child feels about themselves. So then, parent involvement being crucial. So I tried to actually quantify it so that it's called real science. And this is on a relative scale. So don't worry about the actual numbers, just worry about the height of the graph. So the parent one is the parent that was the primary parent in initiating diagnosis. Was clearly the most important person in this process for getting the diagnosis done. And so, for example, a much bigger impact than the teacher or the pediatrician. Now, it is a relative scale, but you also have to be careful in how you interpret it, especially because this shows, for example, special education teacher having less than half the impact. However, it doesn't mean that that person wouldn't know what to do. It just means that that person wasn't involved. And that was another very sad, and I think Laura is going to get more into it. There's a disconnect between classroom teacher and a special education teacher. And the special education teacher perhaps would have been able to be of help because they actually have some of the knowledge in the background, but they were never invited into the room. They were never consulted or pulled into this. So it was really the parent trying to figure out where to go, knocking on different doors. And that was the door that was not open to them. Okay, I have lots of quotes here. So this is, again, just direct quote from a parent, that the TUI diagnosis could have taken place earlier if teachers, school staff, and other professionals, so any of them, had taken my observations seriously. It's very sad, but very true. Then, in addition to being the most important person, parents were also lacking the knowledge that some of these things would have been available if they would have known where to ask. It doesn't mean that the result would have been better, but it would have been quicker in some ways. So parents have the right, but they also have the responsibility to request an evaluation. And that evaluation is no cost to them. School districts are required to give this when you ask for it, but you have to follow a very specific process to do that. And as a typical parent, I can completely relate to this. You tell the teacher what you observe, and the teacher observes it too, but that's not enough, because you have to fill in the you have to use very specific wording to ask for this thing, otherwise you don't get it. It's kind of like, I was trying to think of how to explain it. It's kind of like a house on fire. You keep saying the house on fire, but you actually have to call in 911 and say, please come to this address and put off the fire. That's how I would perhaps describe it. So there's a procedural understanding and a specific language that's needed for this. And again, this doesn't necessarily solve it all, because it's going to be a partial diagnosis and it may not get anything, but still many parents already at this point, there were roadblocks that slowed them down because they did not know to ask, and they were never told to how. There's nobody telling you this is how you do it. Now, and some of that, and I don't want to, this is going to get very political once you start talking to the school district about this, but there is a certain sentiment that some of this appeared to be avoidance to offer this. And to the level that perhaps some teachers definitely felt that they were not comfortable even talking about this topic, but because they felt between the lines, they felt that perhaps their job was on the line if they started crossing this bridge, where it really is the parent's job and not the teacher's job. So anyway, I could write a book about this topic. Now, and again, another quote: I can't believe evaluations for learning differential were never offered by our school, and I can't believe I did not know. I had to ask. So then, very clearly, if the parents thinks that there's something is wrong, the school is not doing anything, they are not asking the school to do anything, then it's very obvious that if you have the means, you're going to go somewhere else. You're going to do it any length of things to help your child. So parents felt they had to go outside their public school district to get an accurate and complete TUI diagnosis, and they did. All of these parents did. Okay, they were motivated really by two things. One, you want to help the child. You can observe the child is suffering. So you're gonna go out somewhere to look for help. And then secondly, you need to have some tool in hand with which you can ask for other things. So this is it doesn't solve everything or maybe even anything, but having an actual diagnosis in hand is some kind of a lever that you can use to ask for things. And these quotes are actually a mixture of children's and parents' quotes, or parents quoting their children. I did not interview the children, I only interviewed the parents. But things that break your heart is when your child tells you that nothing they are good at, nothing they feel good about matters at school. The school does not reward them for the things they're good at. It just punishes them for the things they're not good at. And or having physical signs, having the child hide and not want to go to school, scream at the kitchen floor, kicking and screaming and not wanting to leave the house. Have seen all of that, or bite their fingers until they bleed because they did not want to go to school, because school was such a negative experience for them. So those are the observable signs as a parent that make us go outside the school district very quickly when the school district is not helping us. And then another quote from another parent is that after the diagnosis, they still had to fight for their rights, but they felt that this is something official. It's kind of the doctor title. It makes you more believable. They can't say anymore that it's just you. No, you have it on paper. So there's something here. And then, so this is all from my study. I'm going to do a little detour about the diagnosis and the power of that. So this is from existing previous research, which is why the diagnosis is so important, whether you get it from the school district or whether you get it from outside the school district. It's really important for the student themselves. So the student empowerment part, instead of being the problem as they feel, they have internalized this over the 5-year lag. They have internalized, they've heard so many times from the teachers, possibly also from their parents, over the other parent, that they are, lazy or dumb or just trouble. And the diagnosis makes them realize, once you share it with them, and I'm a great proponent in saying, share this with your child. if they are at the maturity level, age level, that they can understand this, shared with them, that they are great and they are wonderful and they have these amazing gifts. And all these other things are just features of those things, features of their gifts being put in the wrong kind of a box that then causes behavioral, it has to give somewhere, right? So for the child to feel that they are special and they are worthy, and that they have some really cool, interesting things that are their strengths, and they realize that they have really a different way that they learn, and they need to learn their way, and they can really become the architects of their own life, and you are there to help them. And that's really the student empowerment part of diagnosis. And then the parent empowerment, other than feeling, oh my God, I'm not crazy, I didn't imagine this, is to realize that these are all symptoms of the unmet needs, and it's most likely environment that is not serving your students. So this is why diagnosis is important. Then, once you have passed the point of diagnosis, you still have the choice of what are the public resources and what are the private resources you have at your access. And all these parents, they ended up using outside private resources in addition to the public resources. And there are several reasons for that. So in terms of public resources, what you really, as a parent, what you can do is you advocate and you get accommodations. However, accommodations are not going to be enough for our twice exceptional learners, because they also need to build on their strengths. And I have not met a public school yet that is actually providing really strength-based programming. Maybe there's some out there, but I haven't found one yet. So that's where the private resources come in. And however much, we have, all of us, I'm sure we have met wonderful teachers and some less wonderful teachers, but they're great, wonderful teachers in public schools, but they don't really have the resources, and in many cases also not the knowledge to support the TUI learner needs. And that's where private resources come in, either in terms of completely changing a different environment or adding enrichments. And the one that research shows the best kind of schooling for a TUI student would be a strength-based programming in a supporting environment. And that's actually the greatest kind of program for any child. So not only TUI, but that's what TUI learners really makes them thrive. And then obviously you can also do other enrichments in talent development as a subsection. But this is the kind of palette of choices there are. Now, this is the filling of the gap. This gap was this big that these parents that are TUI parents, these are all the different areas of knowledge that they became experts in to fill that gap from my first slide. And again, it's actually amazing. Each of these parents could have written a book about all of these topics. It doesn't mean that all of us need to know all of this, but it is just quite a broad spectrum of areas of specialty, and all of it with a TUI lens. So if you just talk to a regular psychologist or a regular medical doctor, they would not necessarily have exactly this specific knowledge that is relative to the TUI space. So it's quite impressive. But there, I think again, Real is doing a great job in having having all of these information as much as possible available through their site and through all of the speeches and through all of the events. So, but it's a cross section of an amazing amount of knowledge. So then, lastly, as we are trying to fill the gap for all of us, these are just some of the steps that we need to take. And it really, to parent a TUI learner, it really starts with making sure that hopefully all parents and all teachers are able to recognize the TUI characteristics. Because if you don't recognize them, then you're going to be running in the wrong direction. So recognize those characteristics, then knowing how to request the free evaluation. You'll still most likely need the outside evaluation too, but you should request the free evaluation to start. How to advocate for supports, how to communicate with teachers. Again, that's something that it's not going to be done once. It's going to be done every year with every single teacher. So you better get really good at it. What's your spiel? How are you asking for this? How you support your TUI learner at home, how do you connect to other families? We're doing this right now, right? And how do we find more resources and research? So this is all, again, fits right into what Real is doing for all of us. How do we increase our knowledge across all of those spectrums? And then lastly, little challenges. I thought this was cute. So it's really looking through the lens of, we shouldn't be looking at the problem with the child. Maybe the problem we have is, maybe the disability is how we're teaching, how we're parenting these children, really turning the tables. This picture I stole from the internet, so it's not mine, but I just thought it hits the nail on the head. We're trying to make everybody around the child understand that we are the ones who need to re-examine the way we value things, so that we can provide these children with the best support and opportunities to grow and be really, as I said in the beginning, be the architects of their own future with our help. Now, the challenges for us, of course, are how do we make sure the parents still take advantage of all of this? So the outreach and the information can be there. How do we make sure parents come? And then how do we make sure not only teachers apply their training, but we do need classroom teachers to get more training. We need them to, as a first step, really understand and recognize those two-way characteristics, so they do not classify our children in the other categories too soon. And lastly, so this is really me preparing to pass it on to Laura, because now we get to Laura's expertise of why bother with public schools, and there are several reasons why we need to bother with public schools. Most of us, I think, started in any case the process in those, and it's the reason why it's worth the effort is that we really need to going through this process. Sticking it through helps you help your child better. You will understand better what they need and how. And if we don't ask for it, we'll never get it. So it's never fair. It's you get what you negotiate. So knowing what to ask for and how to ask for more. And obviously there are many of us in the public schools. So if we work together, we'll have a stronger voice and more power to negotiate. And then it comes simply also to being a question of resource allocation. There's so much you need to still do outside the system that might as well get maximum you can from inside the system. Also, if we don't push those teachers, then they will never learn. The more we talk to them in the public system, the more mainstream this becomes. Same thing with the parents. The more we engage parents, the better chance there is that they are going to be, that we're able to compress the timeline of diagnosis for the next generation of TUI students. So I will finish with that. I hope I stayed within my 20 minutes, but we'll get back to it.
It's okay. We're not being that exacting. There's such good information in here, and congratulations to you for all your hard work on your dissertation and for sharing those results with us. I think it really helps people feel not so alone too, just to hear that other people have gone down this path, and then to put it all together like that is super helpful. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to having some Q&A time with you later. So before we get to our myth versus fact, I wanted to give Laura some time to give us a bigger picture view and an overview that would answer some of the questions that I know I always have. And I'm very excited to have Laura here with us again. We've actually partnered with her several times in presentations, and she's sort of become our go-to resource when we have questions about how the system works, because she's very familiar with it in her background work as both a special educator on the district side and also a very lengthy career as a special education advocate, which has now culminated in her actually having her own firm, the Special Education Advocacy Group. And we're very excited. Congratulations, Laura, on having your own firm. And I will say she does have a special education teaching credential. She has worked specifically with students in intensive needs classrooms. She won awards for her excellence in teaching. She also has her administrative credential and a master's degree in academic leadership and administration. She was a special ed program supervisor. She's really done just about everything you could ask for in education, and now is putting all of that to work for families as a special education advocate. So I am extremely excited to hand it over to Laura.
Thank you. Do you want me to share my screen so that I can share my slides?
If you don't mind, that'd be great.
That'd be fine. Give me 1 second. Let me just change screens. Okay. I know Callie just gave you a little bit about my work history, but just in terms of my own personal history, born in England to English speaking parents.
Laura, for some reason, we cannot see your slides. At least I cannot.
Let me see.
It's not working as well as it did in our little test.
No, I didn't.
I can't see it either.
It says my screening is working. Hang on.
I have a big white stripe down our. Wonder if you're like zoomed in or something.
Can you see it any better if I do it here on this screen? Okay,
yeah,
so I'll just have to look to my right a little bit if you don't mind, because I'm on this screen and my camera's on this screen. So I was born in England. I did not speak until about a month before I turned 5. My sister and I had our own special language, and nobody knew what I wanted except for her. But then when I started talking in full sentences. And then by the age of 6, I was bilingual. French was actually my first language. English was my second. I have always been interested in special education, honestly, as long as I can remember. I had a godson who was born with Down syndrome when I was 7, and they made me the godson because they were concerned that, you know, as they got older, they wouldn't be able to care for him. And that's really where I began to love working with students with special needs. In high school, I volunteered a lot, and this is back in the day, which I realize ages me quite significantly, but when children were institutionalized, if they had severe needs. And so I spent a lot of really cold and impersonal hours in institutions trying to help children to have some engagement with others. I became a mother, so I have 3 of my own biological children, and I'm stepmother with the Brady Bunch. I'm stepmother to 3. I actually homeschooled my children, and that's when I realized that all 3 of mine, in varying degrees from moderate to severe, have dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. My youngest is definitely a 2E child, and he is a prime example of how the system can fail a child. And that is given the fact that I'm also in education and advocate. So I taught them the foundational skills that they needed, and then enrolled them in school. And I wanted them to also work on their social skills. We did a lot, but it's not the same as learning from somebody other than your mother. And in all honesty, my middle child and I butt heads continuously. So I decided it would be best if they went to school. And I went back and I got my credential. I became a moderate to severe special education teacher, went back and got my master's and my admin credential, and just became very frustrated with the system, if you will. And so I've become an advocate. Some of you might know Renee Lamborn. I started off working with her. And then earlier in the school year, I started my own firm, as Renee has since retired. So in terms of how children who are 2E present at school, I'm sure some of you have had that conversation with teachers that he's the class clown, or he doesn't complete his homework, or he has attention issues. And that is really how a child presents who's bored. And that is generally at the younger grades, I would say probably more in the elementary level. As the children that I work with get older, there is a definite shift at the middle school level where those children now become completely disengaged. They no longer feel successful. They have 6 teachers. Now there's 6 times the amount of people who don't understand them. And so that anxiety and that school refusal starts. The other thing that I see a lot of is students become perfectionistic, where they get so obsessed with being able to do the work to their highest level that it's never good enough. And so it really seems to be somewhere around the middle school age, they kind of go in one direction or the other. And those behavioral difficulties, that immaturity that you see when children are younger now becomes emotional difficulties, whether that's anxiety, whether it's school refusal, whether it's depression. And I have to say that COVID exponentially increased that. The amount of clients that I got over COVID with 2E students who demonstrate average, and I'll use the word average, I would rather it be called acceptable, but average academics or above average, but were off the charts in terms of rating scales. And I'll get to that in a little bit, but that's just how 2E children begin to present at school. Following what Hanna was saying, these are questions that I always want parents to ask. How does your student learn best? Generally, that's a modal modality approach. It's not sitting down with lectures, writing notes. How is your child best at demonstrating their knowledge? Sometimes that's doing projects. You can get students who do these amazing science projects. They can't write what they've done, but they can demonstrate what they've done. How to allow your child to go ahead, knowing their areas of strength while you also know their relative weaknesses. And I always use the term relative weakness because 2E students are not across the board off the chart. They will always have an area that is within the average or the acceptable range, but for them, it's a relative weakness. And so it's always important to know what those are. The other thing to ask yourself is, what skills does your child need? What skills is your child lacking? Is it coping skills? Is it social skills? Is it executive functioning skills? Really understanding your child's intellectual abilities as well as their strengths. And I'll get to why that's so important afterwards. And then you can start to decide, how does your child need to be supported best in school? And so I do think that asking yourself, and I think COVID allowed parents to see their children present this to them more than ever before, because parents were now seeing their students and their children at school rather than just getting the daily school was fine, I did nothing reports from the students. And so I do think that that was an important time for parents to get to know their children better as learners. So it's a very broad area, and I tried to put this onto one slide, and I'm not sure if I did a good job of it, but I really want parents to understand what the school's responsibility is, because once you understand what their responsibility is, you can start learning how to negotiate with them. So the legal requirement of a school district is to provide their students access to the curriculum. They don't need to provide the best educational program possible. They don't need to provide private schools, but the trick is tweaking that to really be able to say, what does your child need to access that curriculum? And it looks very different for every student. And so it's difficult to give a cookie cutter answer, but that's where you can really increase the supports, the services, the goals, everything that your child is receiving from the school. I'm going to touch on this assessments a little in a further slide, but it is important to know that academics are not the only area of assessments. And so if you are requesting assessments from the district, please request assessments in all area of concerns. That can be social emotional, that can be anxiety, that can be pragmatic language. Academics are one part of the puzzle, they're not the whole part, especially with students who are 2E. So know what to ask for and know what your child would benefit from. Don't leave that open-ended, well, how can you help my child? Because no one knows your child better than you do. So you really have to start understanding what you want to ask for. Okay, so this is where I wanted to back up a bit, because I first wanted to explain there is a 5-foot brick wall between educational and medical. And so a school is absolutely not allowed to diagnose any student. They can meet eligibility through a school, but they can only be diagnosed medically. So I have lots of parents who get into that conversation that the school won't diagnose my student, and let's just use autism, for example, as having autism. No, but they can say he's on the autism spectrum, or dyslexia, he has specific learning disability. They can't give you those diagnoses. They can explain to you how your child is eligible for special education. So that's the first tier down, if you will, in terms of medical. And, lots of things can be done through medical insurance, and then educational. And then educational gets split again between general education and special education. One of the things I really want parents to understand is that general education teacher who's standing at the front of the class teaching your child has no training in special education. They are not required to have any special education training in order to receive their certificate for teaching. They can go to a few classes, they attend a few training sessions, but they don't have a very in-depth understanding of what special education is, which is why, like Hanna said, sometimes teachers would rather err on the side of not saying anything, because there is a big cloak, if you will, over special education and the fear of saying the wrong thing. And so knowing who to talk to about special education is extremely important. The school psychologist does know about special education, so they are a contact person. Again, I always feel specifically sorry for school psychologists because they are so overwhelmed. Know who the program supervisor is at the district level who is responsible for your school. Email them, call them, put your child on their radar. They are the ones who can go into schools and help the school teams. So that is always, for me, an important person. Lots of times I'll get parents who say, well, I've talked to the teacher and I've talked to the principal and they're not doing anything. And no, because they don't know special education. And so it really is two separate worlds. And if I could relay that, if there's anything I'd like for you to understand, it's that. It's knowing who to speak with. I know lots of parents will say, I want to volunteer and I want to get involved in the school and I'm the class parent, or I do this for the school. If it's not on the special education side of things, the special education department still has no idea who you are. They still have no idea how you're trying to support your child. So always look in your district for special education. They normally have parent support groups. They normally have parent-led PTA groups. Get involved that way, and that affects greater change than going through the general education side of things. So the assessment process at school, write an email to the principal and to the psychologist stating that you are requesting assessment for special education for your child. You can say, I feel that my child has deficits in this area, though academically he may be or she may be strong. These are my areas of concern. At that point, the district has two options. They need to provide you an assessment plan within 15 days, or they can write you a prior written notice explaining why they are denying your assessment. Even if you get a prior written notice, it's not the end of the line. You just keep fighting. You just say, no, I disagree. This is why. And you keep giving them that information. Again, I've said, for TUI students, they rarely show academic needs. The teacher will say, well, he's reading at level. He's doing this fine. She's able to do her math. Again, it's those splinter skills. It's where is the area of need? Where is the area of deficit? And then from there, you can work with the school team to either have a 504, which is that student receives accommodations, or an IEP when they're also given specific services. The difficulty with an IEP for students who are 2E is that legally to have an IEP, you also have to have specialized academic instruction. And so they have to be in a special education program, whether that's push and support, whether that's resource support, whatever that looks like. And my job is always to minimize how that impacts your child, whether that's through a push and support or through co-teaching at the higher levels. So that's also something to consider. The other thing I want to say about assessments, and it's the most frustrating thing that I do, is that assessments are based on aged normed assessments. In kindergarten and first grade and second grade, the requirements for students is so low. And so parents always are like, but he has this issue. And I really have to say, you have to wait. because those deficits aren't going to show at the kindergarten level because you don't have the difficulties with social or the higher level academics. So again, keep that in mind in terms of, what level and what grade your child is. So again, this is just a level of supports. We haven't touched on it yet, but these are all the different levels of supports that you can get for your 2E, your student with 2E, including non-public schools. They are not private schools. They are private schools that offer special education services, and there are a number of schools for twice exceptional students. There are pros and cons. Not every student enjoys them. They're only there with other students who have 2E, so there are no neurotypical peers. It's considered extremely restrictive, which could be a whole other conversation. But I just wanted to let parents know that, there are students that I have placed in schools that help 2E students, and the district has paid for those programs. It's a little bit more difficult and engaged to get there, but that is also a possibility if the school isn't able to meet your child's needs. So I know I took up more time, but that was the most abridged version I could possibly give.
No, that was great. And we will go back through some of the questions that have come in while you've been chatting. But
Okay.
I really do want to make sure we get through our fact or myth.
Okay, I'm going to stop now so that you can as well.
So I'm going to go through just a list of things that I've heard or parents have emailed us about, just things we've kind of been hearing over the last couple years. And we are very excited to hear if these are a fact or a myth. So here's one. It seems like teachers can't tell parents if they suspect a learning difference. Fact or myth? We have definitely heard, I have talked to teachers who have said, I suspect this child has a learning difference and might be 2E, but I don't think I'm really allowed to say anything. We've heard parents who get little notes kind of passed to them. We've heard parents who've had teachers say, I think this about your child, but don't tell anyone I told you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that. So fact versus myth, Laura, it seems like teachers can't tell parents.
Technically, it's a myth. Technically, teachers are allowed to say they have concerns. However, when I was on the other side of the table, I would anonymously email parents and tell them what they needed to say, because when I was in those meetings, I was told what I could say and what I couldn't say. And it's not, I think this is the difficulty, is that that normally enrages parents. A lot of the difficulty is financial. And at some point that gets to be part of the conversation with the district is this is how much money we have to spend. What can we do? Having said that, at the time, I felt like having the students succeed and receive the supports and services that they needed was more important than that. So that's a kind of tough one. I will say that it's absolutely a fact, a myth that teachers can say, these are my concerns, and they should. Again, that's a split between general education and special education, where a lot of general education teachers are intimidated to say that. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but
yeah, absolutely.
It's a bit of both.
It answered the question. If I can add to it, it is a myth that has de facto become a fact, right? Because that is the lived experience. So for the child and the family, it has become a fact, and for the teachers, become a fact, and it's really hard to change.
I would just like to say on that, though, I so encourage parents to develop those relationships with teachers. Don't look at them as being on the other side. They are really there to help you. And so the less you can alienate them and the more you can get them to share information. And I don't want to say use that information against them. You use that information with the district to show what your child needs. And so it's really creating that cooperation with the district. And that to me is the most important relationship. And again, I in defense of general education teachers, they have such very limited training on this. They're not doing it because they don't want to. A lot of them are doing it because they just don't know.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think Julie Skolnick, who runs the group with Understanding Comes Calm and does the Let's Talk 2E conference every year, she does a whole presentation on working with the school, and she's, she kind of follows this praise, ask, thank model.
Yeah.
Always find the thing that's going well with your child and talk about that, make your ask, and then thank the teacher for all that they do. So and I think a lot of people try that model until it just doesn't work, and so sometimes you end up having to get more adversarial, but most people like to start with that model. So all right, next one. This one has come up a lot. We've seen it in the chat. We see it a lot in questions. If my child's academic performance is at grade level, they won't be eligible for any type of school-based evaluation, assessment, or services. Fact or myth?
It's a myth because it depends on the definition. You really need to, Laura was talking about this, I'm sure she wants to jump on this one, but really depends on what specifically, how well you can define the deficit. It doesn't have to be academic, it can be other things, but again, it depends on your tenacity and ingenuity in framing in such a way.
Yeah, and it also becomes what I was talking about before in terms of understanding your child for their strengths and their weaknesses. And so it really is a matter of, not just asking for academics. They have to do academics anytime they do assessments, but also looking at other things. Pragmatic language is like the soft-spoken language. It's the sarcasm, it's the body language. Typically, some 2E students have a very difficult time with that because it's more gray than black and white. Anxiety, depression, all of those things that it's not a yes or no, and that's why they do rating scales. And as a parent, you provide one of those rating scales. They'll also have a teacher do a rating scale, given the age of the student. If they're old enough, the student will also do a rating scale. I can guarantee you most of the time the student will say, I'm fine. But it's always important to get their input as well. But again, know where your child is struggling and be very clear in how you communicate that to the district, because there will be assessments in all those areas.
So I think this just comes up so much. I just want to really clarify. I think a lot of families in our community have gone and asked and been told, your child is doing fine, your child is meeting standards, or your child's grades are okay, or they're good enough. So no, and they get the pushback. And so Laura, like one clarifying question that came in was, you said sometimes parents have to wait until things get harder, which is kind of that wait to fail model. Like,
Right.
do you have to, and I think we know legally that's not true. Like legally, wait to fail is not actually the model, but it's what do you think in actuality a parent should do if it's a myth?
So it really depends. Again, those younger grades, the K through 2, those are very difficult because socially there aren't a lot of expectations. They will say, and parents will hear this again and again, that it's age appropriate. So if students are still engaging in parallel play at the kindergarten level because they don't have the pragmatic skills to engage with others, they will say, well, that's age appropriate. So you have to wait until your child is showing a deficit. And so I wouldn't say it's a wait to fail, but it's pretty close to a wait to fail. It's you have to wait until you can argue at least that shows a discrepancy. And so again, it's difficult for me, given what I do, because generally if I ask for an assessment, the districts will know there is a good reason why. And so I'm not engaged in those conversations when the district has said no. It's happened on a few occasions, and I've been able to argue why that's so important. But again, those assessments are aged normed assessments. It doesn't matter if the school gives them. It doesn't matter if a private psychologist gives them. They are word for word verbatim. And so I know lots of parents worry about districts giving assessments as opposed to private individuals. Again, it's asking for specific assessments in specific areas.
So the next one was, it seems like my school district actively tries not to find learning disabilities. I thought the federal IDEA law, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, called on school districts to do what's called child find, that they are supposed to be actively looking for learning differences. Fact or myth?
That is a fact. But I can't tell you one district that I think does child find well. There might be one in the East Bay, but it is a fact. The schools do have responsibilities to find students who are struggling and offer them the supports that they need. It is, I can't think in the last decade of a child that I know that came into special education that way.
Now, I was going to ask you about this in the context of the other discussion we had about medical diagnosis versus, I can't remember what you called it, what educational like disability.
Mhm.
I guess I was curious, how does that child find obligation fit with that? So they're obligated to find someone who struggles, but they really aren't allowed to make a diagnosis. Like they can identify dyslexia because that's like an they can identify a specific learning disability,
Yes.
but can they identify autism? Can they say, we've done the test, your child is autistic? They really can't, right?
No, that's a diagnosis. A school is absolutely not able to diagnose a child.
And they can't even, for most 2E children, they cannot even identify dyslexia because of the masking, because the 2E children are, as we all know, so complex and using the other skills. So I haven't, whether it's a fact or a myth, I have not seen any children getting the accommodations they need, being found by the school, because the lens they look through is, are they failing academically? No, they are muddling through. They are muddling through and they are not failing that enough, so therefore they are not passed on.
Mhm.
And I would even say with some 2E students, they may fail, but then the school will say it's behavioral issues. It's that they don't do work completion, they have school avoidance.
They don't work hard enough.
Right.
I think someone posted in their question was more of a comment to us in their RSVP that they actually have had better supports, like when they focus on emotional health over behavioral supports, which I thought was very, very wise.
Yeah.
Now this next one, I mean, if this is true, I don't even know what I'm going to say. I mean, this one just really, when I don't know the answer to this, but like, I've heard, I mean, I think I did look this up, so I think I do know the answer to this, but the fact that people don't know the answer to this is really bothersome. But you tell me. I've heard that school districts legally cannot use IQ tests with children of color to identify strengths or weaknesses. Fact or myth?
That's fact.
I mean, I thought I looked that up and that got outlawed. I thought that they changed that.
They can't do IQ tests because they have shown that those IQ tests are skewed towards the Caucasian race. And so some of those questions in those tests that demonstrate IQ are not based on intellect, are more based on experience. And so they do other tests, but they can't say your IQ is this. They can do other assessments for the students, but they can't denote an IQ.
Can they use the subtests? Like, can they do it, but then not say this is the IQ, but be like, this is, because I mean, we've heard this from parents of color who are frustrated because they cannot get the schools to understand their kids' strengths because they can't use the IQ test or some kind of cognitive ability test to show what the child's strengths are.
So there are lots of cognitive assessments that they can do. They just can't determine the IQ, if that makes sense. So it's a full scale IQ. There's a general ability index.
Yeah.
The IQ is what they cannot use. But that doesn't say that there's lots of other assessments. There's plenty to demonstrate strengths and weaknesses. They just don't need to give you the full scale IQ number.
So they could do like the Wechsler and just not give you that number, but they could give you all the subtests.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. I mean, because I think we all find the one final IQ score to be a little specious, I guess, with 2E kids anyway. It's really having the verbal,
Yeah. No, I think this, I mean, Dr. Merk, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a massive issue with special education about overrepresentation of minorities in some ways, and then underrepresentation of minorities in others. Yeah. And 2E, I would argue, would be in one of those areas in which there is an underrepresentation of some minorities because they don't have access to all of this. And then when they are given those assessments, they are slanted towards the Caucasian rather than minorities. And so it's a very loaded issue right now. It's one that I think special education is going to have to start looking at. The state does always run, keep numbers in terms of the differences among races in special education, and it is always overly representative of Blacks in special day classes. And so that has just been something that I have always been very interested in, because again, I wonder if that is seen through a certain cultural lens that doesn't quite accurately represent those students.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have many to go through, so I'm going to keep moving. I remember reading somewhere that IEPs are supposed to address a child's potential and strengths, not just weaknesses. Fact or myth?
It's a fact, but it really depends again who wrote it and who asked for what, because it only gets there if that's really highlighted and asked for.
What do you think, Laura?
Can you read the statement again?
I remember reading somewhere that IEPs are supposed to address a child's potential and strengths, not just weaknesses. Fact or myth?
So an IEP is supposed to address a child's access to the curriculum. And so I have argued this in both ways. I have argued it in terms of the deficits of what does a child need to meet those grade standard expectations and be able to access the curriculum. I have also argued it that the curriculum isn't high enough, and therefore that is what is negatively impacting the child. And so I think, as with lots of things in special education, it's a little bit of a gray area. Again, it depends on how you argue that. It can be used for the positive, and you can use it for the negative in terms of some schools will say, well, we're giving him access to the curriculum, him or her, he doesn't need to go above that. And I would argue that is why you're seeing the behaviors. And so that's where I tie in the social emotional well-being of the child in terms of how we can get the academics to meet the needs of that child so that we don't have those areas of need. So it's manipulable, I guess I'll say.
Right. All right. Okay, I've heard that schools in California won't use a discrepancy method where they look at discrepancies within the IQ score or between IQ scores and academic performance to identify students' learning disabilities. So for instance, a child, they may have like a high verbal, let's say, on their IQ, but not be able to read well. And you can use discrepancy. Is that a fact or a myth that we can't use a discrepancy method?
That's a myth, and that is used a lot. That's how you qualify a student under specific learning disability, is that there is a discrepancy between their cognitive ability and their academic ability.
Okay.
But at the same time, again, I have seen schools do exactly that, which is they average out and they say on average, there's no problem. Therefore, this child does not qualify for anything. So again, I think it's one of those where maybe it is a myth, but the school districts certainly are falling for it.
Right. And that also gets back to knowing, and this is so difficult, is knowing what specific assessments to request or what areas to request, whether it's auditory processing, visual processing, it's all those areas. And, it's learning how to ask for those so that so it demonstrates those discrepancies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want an assessment so that I understand my child's suspected learning disabilities, if any, and I can't afford a private evaluation. But I've heard that the school district actually isn't obligated to provide testing for my child. They can just put my child on a 504 without doing any evaluation. Fact or myth?
Okay, so there's lots of parts in that, but I think all of those are myths.
So basically, I can request the evaluation. they are obligated to at least respond to my request for the evaluation.
That's fine.
Yes.
I can keep arguing for it if they push back, and they cannot just put my kid on a 504 without doing an evaluation. Now, you can have a 504 without an evaluation,
Right.
but they can't use that as an excuse
Excuse for not assessing.
for not assessing.
No, if you're requesting the assessment, you will get a response. And if you are clever enough in requesting, you actually will get
Mhm.
an assessment.
Yeah. And again, it's knowing what areas of disabilities to ask for assessments in.
And do you have any like good resources for parents to know that? Like how do they formulate their request?
That is my biggest frustration. And one day when I have enough time, I would love to create something for parents to go where they can learn about that. Unfortunately, you learn by doing. I have to say, I didn't even learn it during my special education credentialing program. I learned it in the classroom, working with school districts, working with different students, working with different strengths and weaknesses. There is not an easy, Google search that populates all of those needs. And so that is a little bit of my frustration, is how to help parents know what to say and know how to ask for those assessments.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good to know that's identifying a gap gives us some idea of what we need to fill, right? Okay. Okay. I thought that the district would let me know if my child should be evaluated for a learning disability, but someone told me that's not true, that I have to make the request in writing, and that is what triggers the district to start the process. Fact or myth?
So both. It's fact that that parents shouldn't have to ask for assessments. And it's a fact that the school should offer it. But if they don't, then yes, a parent needs to write a letter requesting assessments, specifically asking for assessments in the specific areas, because if you just ask for assessments, they will do a psycho-ed and an academic, and that is all. And so knowing what the other concerns are, like that was my first slide, because that's so important in understanding and learning about your child. Is, if it's behavior, ask them to do a behavior assessment. If it's speech language, whether it's receptive, expressive, pragmatic, knowing what to ask for. I mean, obviously, if your child is able to communicate at an age-appropriate way, you don't need to ask for an expressive speech language assessment. But knowing what assessments to ask for is how you will really start that process working.
That was one that, that's a very personal one for me, because we did not know we needed to ask, and we never did.
And I will honestly tell you that there are some parents I've worked with who have said, I asked the teacher, I asked the principal, I asked the psychologist about assessments, and they said no. And I, and then you ask, well, did you put it in writing? Did you put it in an email? Did you date and timestamp it? And that's what triggers it. And if not, it doesn't rise to the level that it needs to in order to get some attention.
All right, I have 3 more. I know our chat has been blowing up during this
presentation,
unlike any other chat we've ever had. So
I'm trying to keep up.
I love it. Don't worry. I think Yael and Abby are trying to help stay on top of it. And Yael is doing it from a bathroom in a hotel in Boston while she's on her child's school trip. So, okay. I hear I will need to be confrontational and firm to get the district to work with me, that I won't be able to approach them collaboratively. Fact or myth?
Myth.
It's a myth. There's a fine line between being persistent and being polite. You have to be knowledgeable and firm, and you have to understand the process, and you need to follow the process and all of those things. But being confrontational usually is not going to help alone. But knowing the law, knowing the language you need to use, and the process, those are the things, and not giving up. And I think all of us, if we would have had somebody like Laura working with us, we would have been able to do it quicker and better. So that would be getting other resources to help you, but just being confrontational is not going to help you alone.
All right. Anything to add there, Laura?
No, when you get a chance, I wanted to just answer the question about what the difference is between a 504 and an IEP.
Oh, go ahead.
So I'm not sure if we have this still, but I did a presentation about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer, about the difference between a 504 and an IEP. In a nutshell, a 504 provides accommodations within the general education environment. An IEP provides services with measurable goals and accommodations. But that's the difference between a 504 and an IEP and both are enforceable. Lots of parents will say, but a 504 doesn't really count. And it does. A 504 goes through the Office of Civil Rights, and IEP goes through the Department of Education. So they're both enforceable. They're both useful. They both help students. You just have to determine, does your child need special education to access the curriculum, or do they need accommodations to access the curriculum? I've worked with lots of parents who we've gone through the assessment process, and then they've said, oh, but I don't want my student in SPED. I just want him to get help. And it's like, but that's the difference. Special education is services as well as accommodations. A 504 is accommodations.
Great. I've heard some districts are easier to work with for assessment and support than others. Fact or myth?
Absolute fact. Absolute fact. And I think Laura agrees. Just because there's some legal questions, there are two sites, rightslaw.com, and I wrote that down there, is a very good one. And then understood.org is another good one that I use all the time for all these things.
Yeah, and I think, Laura, you probably would even agree too that like sometimes it's even who you're working with within the district. I mean, we find some schools are easier to work with than others. Some schools are easier to work with some years than others, depending on who is in charge.
And I can't tell you how many parents ask me, what school or what teacher should I put my kid in? And the difficulty is, as you have all experienced, every summer, everything gets reshuffled. And so that's why it's so difficult to give you that specific information, because it really does so much depend on the teachers, on the special education support staff, moving up on the attitude of the districts. There are definitely some districts I look forward to working with, and there's definitely some districts I don't. But again, I think the experience of me knowing the districts and knowing what they're going to say and being able to argue those points makes it a little bit of an easier common ground, if you will. At least they know I have that experience to be able to say, I know you're going to say this, but this is what we want to ask for. But yeah, it really depends. And I'm sure you can all attest to who you have who's directly working with your child.
Yeah. All right, last one from me. We have some questions in the chat. I've heard I might be able to hire an advocate and get reimbursed for the expense if I qualify.
The only time that I know that my services have been reimbursed is by a few parents who work for certain companies in the South Bay. It is not reimbursable by insurance. It's not reimbursable by the district. That is the only experience that I've had with a parent who's been able to get reimbursed.
Do you know for people who have not as the financial resources for it, are there options for them?
So I always try and do some
pro bono work.
Pro bono work for families. Just because that's why I got into this, to help families, and getting back to what I was saying before in terms of the disproportionate amount of children. So I always try and do some pro bono work. It just gets to be very difficult in terms of balancing that schedule with clients. One of the things I would love to do would be to create a kind of a search engine, if you will, for parents. I just have not had the time to do that yet. But, hopefully sometime down the line, I'll be able to have more of a place where parents can go to get help.
Well, thank you so much. Abby, I don't know if you've been keeping track of questions, or I can just scroll back to the top, because I know there were questions all the way through.
A lot of things people have been contributing and answering.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have anything that stands out. I mean, one of the questions I put in there, and then some people answered, but I think would be interesting to suss out the details, is, I've heard that you have to get reassessed every 3 years in order to keep your, well, this is the question. Is it both for the IEP and the 504? Is it only for the IEP? Yeah, and how is that true?
So for that IEP, they've changed it now from calling it from a triennial to a reassessment. So every 3 years, a child needs to be reassessed in all areas of suspected disability. That doesn't mean that you can't ask for early assessments if you're concerned about a certain portion of the educational program, or if you're just worried in general about the program, you can ask for early assessments. You cannot ask for it within the same year. Assessments cannot be done within the same year or they invalidate those results. So just getting back to what Dr. Merk was saying in terms of requesting private assessments, please make sure that you coordinate that between the person who's doing the private assessments and the school, if they have done any or they're going to do any. I have worked with some parents that didn't communicate that and they completely invalidated all of the results. For a 504, you don't necessarily need to have an assessment. You can. Generally, you will have a reassessment to see if that child still qualifies for 504. You don't necessarily need to have assessments for it. It depends on why that child has a 504.
So we're going to go through a bunch of these questions, and if we run over a little bit, is that okay?
Yeah.
And I want to just tell people, though, if you need to drop off, don't feel obligated to stay. I think one of the things that I'm really myself personally taking away from everything you've said, like if I had to boil it down and just tell everyone before they drop off, is really the number one thing I'm taking away is you are entitled to ask for these evaluations and assessments, but you have got to do it in writing. And I think that's something parents just don't know. And it's one of those things you don't know until you need to know. And even then, no one tells you. And so we are all in this group because we are probably also connected to other parents who are who have kids with challenges. And the more we can support each other, like to get the word out, like if you know other families who are struggling, please tell them that they need to make the request and they need to make it in writing, and they are entitled to do so. Because I feel like that is the number one thing I personally did not know. And no one was ever going to tell me that because it's not something they put in the school newsletter. That's not advertised. That's, so we just need to do a better job of letting people know that that's their right.
And I think in combination with that, I would tell every parent, you are your child's best advocate. And it doesn't have to be personal. It doesn't have to be confrontational. This is a professional environment. It's no different than if you went to work and you had a disagreement with a coworker. It doesn't have to be that confrontational. It's a serious request. You have serious concerns. I will say I have a child with an IEP. She's now in college, but every year at her IEP, I would cry because it's such an emotional thing. And so as much as you can take that emotion out, as much as you can look at your child in terms of data points, in terms of black and white, is a benefit to you. And I know as a parent, that's sometimes very difficult to do, but that's what the school will respond to more than just the anecdotal, my child is sad, my child is depressed. Mm-hmm. Look at the attendance records, look at the zeros your child has for schools. All of those are important factors that the school needs to be addressed.
Hannah, I don't know if you have a kind of final remark before we go through questions. Well, we can keep going through the questions, but some people may need to drop out.
Yeah, I understand. And absolutely, it's a very, very important to get an assessment done, have the diagnosis done. And it's really important we get the word out that help is available, but you have to ask for it the specific way. But then I'd also like to balance that with Laura, excellent advice about trying to keep it professional, keeping the emotion out of it. But for most of us, we only have that one experience to practice it with, so it's really hard. It becomes easier as you go through the process, but the first time around, it's quite overwhelming. And because there are all this mix of emotions, your child is suffering, you thought the school was there to help, how come they're not helping me? So it is really hard. So we also there, I think parents need to come together and share this. The more we share about this, the more we can manage it and and empower ourselves. But then just, I don't want to depress anyone, but still having that plan in place and having the assessments, having the diagnosis, having a plan, it's still, again, only the beginning, because you have to understand that every single time there's a new teacher, the teacher may have the paper of these are the accommodations for your child. It doesn't mean that they happen. It doesn't mean that the teacher gets it. And that's, again, getting back to Callie's point of, or earlier point where it's, Laura, you made the point as well, it's so important to build the relationship with every single teacher, everybody who works with your child. You are going to be the advocate for life. You're going to, every single time a new teacher comes in, you're going to be there with your little spiel, educating them on what's special about your child, educating them about 2E, telling them how to take this plan to life, how they can be your partner in helping your child. And that's something that the school, again, it's the parent will have to do that, that heavy lifting every time.
So I also just want to say I want to thank Hanna and Laura. Thank you so much for letting us put you in the hot seat and go through the facts and the myths, and for sharing your vast experience and knowledge with us. And I think also just creating a platform for everyone in our chat tonight to be able to talk with each other about their experiences and the way they're experiencing these facts and myths in their everyday lives, which I think just shows there's so much more we have to do to help everyone, teachers and parents, understand kind of what's fact and what's myth, and the gray areas in between. So thank you very, very much. And I'm going to start going through some of these questions. Yael has tried to collate through everything and send me the ones that haven't been answered. But we are not really going to be able to address individual, like super individualized specific questions. If you would like to reach out to Laura or Hanna, you can do that. And you can also join our Google group if you're not part of it already. I'll ask Abby if she doesn't mind putting the link to that in the chat. That's another great place because, I mean, Laura is fantastic, but she's also like, she's got her firm, and I don't want to overwhelm Laura. I do want to overwhelm Laura, but I don't. So sometimes people in our Google group have advice that they can provide, and it's a great place to post your more specific questions. So question for you all is, and I had only vaguely answered this in the chat, but is there any research that shows whether there is a difference between the accuracy of public school evaluations versus other sources of evaluations? I would say in our experience, what we've heard is that some schools really do excellent evaluations, and other schools don't. And it can vary by who's doing it. But a lot of people we know who have had private evaluations and school evaluations have actually been pretty impressed with their school evaluations on the whole, but that's not always the case. And I think for getting a neuropsychological evaluation, I'm pretty sure you have to go private for that in most cases, but I could be wrong. So you guys tell me, fact versus myth, what do you think?
Well, let me cover that quickly. Any assessments that a school does have to be school-based. So they can't do a neuropsych because a neuropsych is a medical assessment. You don't want a non-medical person doing medical assessment as you would not want a medical person doing a school-based assessment. I can't say it enough that these assessments, normed reference assessments, they are scripted. Ideally, how one person does it is exactly how another person does it. To me, it's not a question of who does the better assessment, it's who does the most thorough assessments in terms of what other assessments are they looking at, what other assessments are they doing. That's, to me, the difference between how assessors do it. It's, everybody can give the Wyatt, everybody can give the Woodcock-Johnson, but what other assessments are you looking at? Are you just providing that as your basis for your assessment, or are you looking at other areas, and that gets back to parents knowing specifically areas of need. If you just say, I want assessments for special ed, you'll get a cognitive and an academic, and that will be it. If you say, I want assessments for special education, I have concerns about my child's auditory processing or visual processing or, visual motor integration, whatever the areas are, you'll also get all those additional assessments. So again, it's not the specific assessment itself, it's the breadth and the level of assessments that they're going to provide.
And only one of them is going to suggest other assessments. So if you get assessment A done publicly versus privately, yes, the quality of it is going to be very similar, comparable, but only the private side is going to say, well, in addition to this, we also want this and that. And the public side is never going to suggest anything. They'll do what you ask for. And the private side will say, okay, well, this isn't the whole picture. Let's paint the whole picture.
Yeah. And I think we've often found too, like, but I don't know if this is true or not. This has been our experience that it helps if the assessor has some knowledge of twice exceptionality, because it's not so much that they're going to get different results, but they might think of the child differently, understanding that it is possible for a child to have a very jagged profile. And then the recommendations they may give if they have a twice exceptional background might be slightly different, because they're going to may emphasize strengths more in that like set of recommendations, as opposed to just how do we address deficits. I think that's probably what we found more. It's not that the results are different, but maybe the conversation is different sometimes, how you look at the information and what you do with it.
Ties in well, Callie, to one of the questions that's in here. It says, what is the status of formal 2E diagnoses being available and recognized by school districts? And I know we were just talking about how school districts can't diagnose, but I think there's still the question, like, how much do public schools, do you feel, in the Bay Area, we can be specific, know the signs of 2E? So when they look at all these different evaluations that they ask for, are they able to see that in the patterns, or are they not aware of that?
That's a tough question, because 2E is not an eligibility for special education. So, there are 13 criteria and not one of them is 2E. So I don't know how to say this. I don't know if having that label is the significant difference between receiving services and not. I don't know if that makes sense, but again, it's trying to fit that child into one of those 13 eligibility criteria so that they can qualify for special education services. What I find actually in working with the parents that I do is the proportion of parents who don't know that their child is 2E, who I have to review these assessments and have that conversation with them, which is, you do realize your child is twice exceptional. And they will say, well, I just thought she was really bright. Or I just thought he was good at math. And so it's not just educating the educators, it's educating the parents as well. And I try very hard to not make it us versus them. Whether that's parents versus school, or private versus public, or educational versus medical, because I don't think that helps the child. And so if I could say anything, it would be, I want everybody to become better educated about it. I want educators, I want parents, I want doctors, I want psychologists, I want everybody to become more educated about these kids who have amazing strengths, but somehow can't get past their areas of difficulty to really demonstrate their true gifts.
And somebody else asked a pretty specific question. I was curious about this too. You talked about the non-public schools, and we don't have a list of those ourselves. Like, I know there's Esther B. Clark, and I know certain schools are private schools and qualify as NPS2. Like, I can't remember the name of the one up in Burlingame. Do you know of a list anywhere of non-public schools?
So there is a list. You can Google non-public schools and you get a whole list of all the schools in the area. The difficulty is knowing what schools do what and what schools are accepting and how to get into some schools. Some schools you need to have an IEP and can only be funded by districts. Other schools are only funded privately by parents. Esther B. Clark, for example, is really for students who have serious emotional disturbances. So you wouldn't want necessarily, a 2E child going into that environment unless their social emotional difficulties were what were the main impact in their educational program. So that's the difficult part as well, is being able to say to parents, and again, special education is a continuum of services, and it goes back to my slide that I made, it goes from least restrictive to most restrictive. And so you have to justify every step along that continuum. So even though there are no non-public schools that do a great job of educating 2E students, you can't go from being in general education to a non-public school. And that's not, there's a process in terms of how to work that and how to help your child succeed in along that course of different programs.
And then we do, I mean, you do hear the stories that are coming out of New York, and maybe this isn't going to be as big a thing, about so many parents of 2E kids sue the district and get reimbursed just to send their kids to private schools. And I know that has happened some in our area, but I think not as much.
So private schools do not offer any special education services. So if you have a child who's 2E and has deficits, whether it's language-based, whether it's, a specific subject academically, they won't be able to provide that special education curriculum. And when I have conversations with parents, it's always, what is the end goal? And generally the end goal is, I want my student to go off to college and live a very successful, happy, independent life. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty with non-public schools is, I know a few really good ones who go up through middle school, and then after middle school, there's none. And so if your child isn't fully equipped to matriculate back into a general education high school, we're a little stuck. And so that's, the goal always needs to be, and non-public schools are not permanent. You wouldn't put a child in a non-public school in kindergarten and can keep them all the way through senior year. It's to recoup the skills or to access the skills that they need to be.
Yes, and I'm not talking about the non-public schools. I'm talking about, like,
can I just say to Jane, who wrote that I said no good non-public high schools, there are not any very good non-public high schools for 2E students specifically.
Okay, but so like in New York, it's not sending them to non-public high schools. It's basically saying, I get them to Flex or Quad or one of these schools that are specific for 2E kids,
right,
or even some of their private schools that can support 2E kids. And I would say, like, here in our area, for some students and not for all, Mid-Peninsula High School, where my daughter goes, can do some support for 2E learners. Compass High School certainly could do something like that. Stanbridge might be able to support some 2E learners.
There are some private schools.
Yeah, even like Nueva has 2E kids who are very bright but have some learning differences. So, and that's different. That's like. And I don't even know, like, that. I know that happens some in this area, but I don't hear about it a lot. Not like you do hear about it in other places. And I was just kind of curious why that is, if you even know.
You're specifically asking about why parents don't sue the district.
Yeah, why that doesn't seem to happen as much here. And I wonder if it's because it's not going to happen as much. Like, part of it is they had gifted programs, and so those kids were not being given access to the gifted programs, but we don't have that, so you can't argue your child is missing something that doesn't exist, maybe.
I don't know, it could be just a cultural, geocultural issue here. Some people select to go to private schools for many different reasons, and I think that there's a socioeconomic structure that enables people to make those choices sometimes here for various reasons. So that could contribute to it. But I do find, just on the point of, like, are there private options? There are private options that work for some people. And you mentioned some of those schools, and there's some specific schools for dyslexic students that have a significant 2E population, for example, but it depends on the combination. Our daughter actually goes to Fusion. That's another model. There are a couple of schools that offer one-on-one instruction, which by itself enables a 2E learner to advance in areas where they can advance faster, and in other areas get more support because they need or have an accommodation in it. So there are options, but those are very expensive options, and that doesn't solve the problem as it should for everyone.
The last question I have, which I think is ending on a reasonably positive note, but I may be missing some more questions at the bottom, is just, do you know anyone who's had success obtaining enrichment or acceleration through the public schools? Like, anyone who's been able to argue that that's part of the appropriate part of FAPE, which is fair and appropriate public education, but short of hiring an attorney.
I have a student who is currently in 3rd grade, but doing 11th grade math. And so I have been able to argue that he needs access to that grade level work. Parents still want to keep him in the public school socially. He's not age appropriate to be in 11th grade in a high school class. And he does have some gaps, like he's amazingly bright, but then when you do, some of the basics, it's more difficult. But I think that is where it's necessary to work with the individual districts about that individual child. So I have been able to work in terms of getting different curriculums. It's just, I can't say overreaching. I do it with all 2E students just because, again, like I was saying, some districts are easier to work with than others. Some it's a longer conversation, shall I say, than others.
And this is not exactly an answer to that one, but I still want to put it in, which is that there are other school options that are interesting. So for example, Palo Alto and a couple of other school districts, they have a program with the community colleges, which is hugely interesting. So at Foothill College, it's called Middle College. It takes 11th and 12th grade students, where you can take college level courses, obviously Foothill college level courses, which enables you to build on your areas of strength. And at the same time, they have their own small community doing the English and history every day with their small group. So you have a mini school within Foothill of high school students. And that's, for example, something with one of our daughters did, which I felt was a really nice combination of support and accelerating in other areas. So, and that's completely public and free.
And one of our 2E teen bloggers actually did that program. So, and she talked a lot about just how supportive the teachers there were, and she really loved it. Laura, somebody asked if you're familiar with Springstone in Lafayette.
I am.
I haven't covered that school.
Yeah, it's it would be difficult for me to say if it would be appropriate for a student with 2E or not. It has, from my experience, more children on the spectrum than 2E. So the academics might not be as rigorous as a 2E student might need.
I think we find these things are all very personal. And I think the thing that we always talk about in terms of school selection, whether it's private or public or whatever it is it really depends on the kid. Every kid has their own needs, and you have to think about what the goals are. And almost no school is perfect. I don't think there is a perfect school for any child, but definitely not for a 2E child. So you just have to think about the trade-offs. Even my pretty neurotypical academically motivated kids, there are things they do and don't like about school. That's kind of life, and so I think with our 2E kids, it's even more about thinking about the trade-offs and what that child needs, and at that time what that child needs. Right. Quite frankly,
and it changes. It does change.
It changes, and these kids seem to change quite a lot. Yes, Maria, an autistic child can be twice exceptional. I think what Laura was saying is it's a school that maybe is not all autistic children are twice exceptional, just like not all twice and exceptional children are autistic. So, schools may skew for different kinds of needs for different kids. So, yes, Jane, more better days than bad days. So, I think that was it. Did I miss anything? We've gone 15 minutes over, and I really hate to be disrespectful of our speakers' time. They've so graciously donated their time to be with us today. I'm going to stop recording.